Welcome to the age of ink. When games were played on paper boards instead of computer screens and were powered by dice instead of microprocessors. In this episode, I'd like to tell you about one of the board games I liked the most as a kid, and certainly my top one when it comes to play again now. This game is Havoc, a wargame set in medieval England, with simple but efficient rules and attractive design that produced very addictive gameplay. And I guess I wasn't its only fan, because the first release was soon followed by an extension called Siege, and then several other adaptations. Samurai Blades, Vikings, Crusades, and Black Dragon, also called Dark Blades, and which was the only one set in a medieval fantasy world, whereas all others were historically accurate. All of them shared the original Havoc concept, a tabletop wargame set on a sub-tactical scale where one unit is represented by one character. They had very similar rules, with only a few minor variants between them, mostly due to new types of units, siege engines, Viking ships, or fantastic creatures. The games were published in 1981 by Standard Games and then translated in local versions, mostly French, a few years later by Rexton, then Eurogames. Havoc has one thing in common with another great game, Talisman. And also with the Lone Wolf Gamebook series. The illustrator is Gary Chalk. These were the very best games I ever played, and I don't think the fact that they were illustrated by the same person is just a coincidence. Mr. Chalk is not only a talented artist, but also played an important part in game conception. He obviously has a deep sense of medieval heroic fantasy, and that makes the difference. Havoc uses large maps, 40 by 60 centimeters, that can be combined to create larger battlegrounds. The map boards are printed on semi-laminated cardboard stock of good quality. They are fully hand-drawn with a luxury of details. The grid is made of large hexes, 2 centimeters wide representing 2 meters of actual terrain, and hand-drawn as well. The fact that not a single line was machine-generated, the bright colors used, and the talent of Gary Chalk, all these combined together give a specific warm and cozy feeling to these maps. Same thing with the units, which are the master key success factor of the series. They all have their dedicated, gorgeous, colorful illustration printed on the counter, and even though some of them look the same, small details make them different from one another. The game scale is 1 man, 1 counter, though in fact each character is represented by more than one counter depending on his state of health and whether he is mounted or dismounted in the case of knights. Playing pieces include spearmen, halberdiers, sergeants, armed peasants, archers with short or long bows, crossbowmen, knights with their horses, and a few civilians with carts and cattle. Each character has its own name, which makes the playing experience very personal, especially as you follow the fate of your knights and men-at-arms through the scenarios. Each one has 3 characteristic values: attack, printed in black, defense, in red, and movement, in blue. These characteristics vary with the health status of the person. A wounded character has approximately half his initial values. Cavalry have additional double-sized counters showing the mounted state, both normal and wounded, and the dismounted horse. The fact that all stats are printed on the counter front and back eliminates any bookkeeping. If a person is wounded, stunned, or killed, the relevant counter is just flipped on the backside. The game contains well over 100 characters in total. You can play Cry Havoc using one of the excellent scenarios, which provide background story, order of battle, and victory conditions, or using your own setup, which allows for endless possibilities. But it's easier to find a good strength balance between players when you play small skirmishes than when you play large battles extending over several maps. The game is played in turns with a fixed sequence of action: fire, move, fight. Movement is governed by terrain and the unit's available points. Fire and fighting are governed by tables. You roll a 10-sided die, cross-index the roll with the table column, and get the result. For missile fire, the column used depends on weapon type, range, and defensive cover. For fighting, you first need to calculate an attack versus defense ratio, depending on the strength of all attacking units as opposed to the strength of the defending one. The result points to a table column, which is then modified for terrain influences and other factors. As a result of the fighting, the character can be forced to retreat, stunned for one round, wounded, or killed. Even with a considerable number of characters on each side, the game plays fast and smoothly. In turbulent skirmishes, it is sometimes hard to see at one glance which characters belong to which player, since the counters have no faction marks. Far from a handicap, this actually provides another level of realism to the game. The maps are so well designed that you can play a single one over and over again without getting bored. I remember playing the village dozens of times, with just minimal changes to the initial balance of forces between players. Just like chess, same board, but endless variations. Still, there was some room for change if we consider the many extensions or clones that followed the initial game release. They all shared a similar map design, rules, and unit system, and although they did not enjoy the gorgeous illustrations by Gary Chalk, they were still decent enough to make them look like official extensions to the original game. Siege added 2 superb maps of castle and camp. Of course, extra units included various siege engines, catapults, ladders, burning oil, and so on. I bought this one almost at the same time with Cry Havoc, so to me, both are like one large game. At least a couple of years passed before I felt the need to extend the universe. That tells a lot about the awesomeness of these first releases and their enormous possibilities. Samurai Blades took you farther away, to medieval Japan. It offered interesting maps where you could play ninjas, warrior monks, samurais, and peasants with the same pleasure as with the original game. Instead of the English countryside, players would fight each other in the land of the rising sun and its exotic environment, with so typical cherry trees in blossom, temple pillars, housings of paper straw. Doesn't it look great? Viking Raiders took you a few centuries earlier, adding naval battles with drakars, merchant ships, and all, for those who would like to replay the dramatic fights of Ragnar Lothbrok and his people. Here's also the fortified city and several other maps that were sold separately. All of them are very well made, with a design quality comparable to that of the original series. Last but not least, Dark Blades. Here, the French version, Black Dragon, offered you the possibility to play Cry Havoc in a heroic fantasy world. Elves, dwarves, orcs, goblins, gargoyles, dragons, magicians, all you ever dreamed of adding to the Cry Havoc original world. I spent hours playing this very cool add-on, where you could begin a fight in the open and finish it underground, in caves and dark tunnels. Cry Havoc opened the way to a wonderful series of games that defined a new standard. Some will see them as war games for beginners. That may be so, but I'd rather say that they just reduced the scale from strategy to tactical, and most important, they introduced the extremely addictive gameplay. I'm sure they wouldn't have enjoyed the same success if it wasn't for their awesome style and illustrations. Again, thanks to Gary Chalk. Recommended to all ages, play this again and again. See you soon in the wonderful age of ink.